Thinking about money feels hard in a way that's difficult to explain. Not confusing, not technical, just heavy. You sit down to think, and your mind slows before you even begin. You know what you're supposed to look at, what you're supposed to decide, what you're supposed to face, but something inside you resists the moment thinking starts. Not panic, not fear. Wait. Fog. A sense that this will cost more energy than you have available. So you delay. You tell yourself you'll do it later. You wait for urgency to force you into motion because urgency temporarily overrides the heaviness. And when you do finally engage, it feels draining almost immediately, like your system was bracing before the first thought finished forming. You don't feel stupid. You don't feel incapable. You feel depleted, as if thinking itself pulls from a battery that never quite recharged. That's the part people misunderstand. It's not that you don't understand money. It's that your brain treats thinking about it like labor, cognitive effort that demands focus, vigilance, tracking, restraint, and emotional regulation all at once. So even neutral tasks feel taxing. Even simple decisions feel loaded. You can feel the resistance rise as soon as money enters your awareness. Your attention tightens. Your mind looks for exits. And because this isn't dramatic, you don't label it as stress. You label it as being tired, being busy, being overwhelmed. You assume the problem is time or motivation, but the pattern stays the same. Every time you try to think clearly, the heaviness shows up first. Over time, that heaviness becomes familiar, expected. You stop noticing it as a signal and start treating it as a trait. Thinking about money feels hard, so you assume it will always feel hard. And once that assumption settles in, you stop questioning the weight. You just carry it. Here's the part most people miss. Thinking about money didn't start feeling hard because you're bad at it. It started feeling hard because your brain learned something specific over time. It learned that thinking rarely led to relief. You thought, and nothing resolved. You thought, and more responsibility appeared. You thought, and the list got longer instead of shorter. So your brain stopped associating thinking with completion and started associating it with cost. Mental cost, emotional cost, energy cost. And once that association forms, the resistance shows up before the thought does. The heaviness arrives first. The fog rolls in early, not to stop you, but to slow you down. Because slowing down feels safer than engaging fully in something that has never really paid you back. So your mind hesitates. It looks for distraction.
Not because it's lazy, but because it learned that thinking about money leads to more load, not less. And when that lesson repeats often enough, thinking stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling like something you have to prepare for. At a certain point, this stops being about preference or effort and starts becoming survival logic. Your brain no longer treats thinking about money as neutral cognition. It treats it as threat exposure. Not because something bad is happening, but because something bad might. And survival systems don't wait for proof. They work on prediction. If thinking has repeatedly led to pressure, uncertainty, or unfinished loops, your nervous system prepares for that cost in advance. So before you even start thinking, your system braces. It slows you down. It clouds your focus. It creates friction on purpose, not to sabotage you, but to conserve energy in a system that already feels stretched thin. When thinking feels expensive, avoidance becomes protection. Delay becomes regulation. And because this happens quietly, you don't experience it as fear. You experience it as mental fatigue. You tell yourself you're not in the right headspace. You assume you'll think more clearly later. But what's really happening is that your system learned that engaging fully doesn't lead to relief, so it limits engagement by making thinking itself feel heavy. And once that pattern sets in, clarity doesn't disappear. Access to clarity does. The understanding is still there, but reaching it now requires pushing through resistance your system believes is necessary for survival. When thinking feels consistently heavy, it starts reshaping identity. You don't decide this consciously. It forms slowly. You begin to see yourself as someone who just doesn't think clearly about money, not because you lack intelligence, but because every attempt feels harder than it should. You notice how quickly your mind disengages. And when something always costs more energy than it seems to cost other people, the mind looks for an explanation. It doesn't say my system is overloaded. It says this must be who I am. So the story forms. I'm bad with money. I get overwhelmed easily.
Even when the evidence doesn't fully support it, the experience does. And that's where the conflict deepens. Because part of you knows you're capable, you understand concepts, but another part of you has learned that thinking about money comes with too much weight attached. So you start trusting the version of yourself that avoids over the version that engages, not because it's truer, but because it feels safer. And the longer that version stays in control, the more natural it feels to think of yourself as someone whose mind just shuts down around money. Thinking stops feeling like a skill you can use. It starts feeling like a capacity you don't have. And once that belief settles in, the difficulty stops feeling situational. It starts feeling personal. This is where the pattern becomes mechanical. Loss aversion moves to the front. When thinking already feels costly, avoiding mistakes feels safer than engaging fully. Present bias follows. Immediate relief matters more than long-term clarity. Distraction feels smarter than effort. Avoidance feels efficient. Guilt loops fill the gap. You feel guilty for not thinking.
Guilty for falling behind? Guilty for knowing better but not acting. That guilt doesn't create momentum. It keeps the system on alert. And the more often this happens, the more neural pathways strengthen around it. Repetition wires the response. Quiet mental strain repeated often enough becomes automatic. Over time, money dysmorphia sets in. Your perception of your financial reality becomes distorted by the effort required to think about it. Two people can have similar situations. One feels clear, the other feels fogged. The difference isn't intelligence, it's internal load. And once this loop is running, identity-based income ceilings form without any conscious decision. Not ceilings on what you can earn, but ceilings on what feels safe to mentally engage with. More money feels like more thinking, more decisions, more strain. So part of you resists expansion, even while consciously wanting it. And that resistance isn't failure, it's protection. Here's what makes this pattern so persistent. The loop no longer needs new input. The more thinking feels heavy, the more you avoid it. The more you avoid it, the more unfinished money stays active in the background. The more unfinished it feels, the more alert your system stays. And that alertness doesn't sharpen thinking, it exhausts it. Each cycle lowers your available mental capacity slightly, not enough to notice all at once, just enough to make the next attempt feel heavier than the last. Over time, urgency replaces clarity. You think only when pressure forces you to. That trains your brain to associate thinking with stress instead of resolution. Engagement becomes something you endure. Fog becomes familiar, and familiarity starts to feel safer than effort. So the system chooses consistency over improvement, predictable mental strain over uncertain clarity. The loop doesn't just repeat, it tightens. Thinking about money stops being a task you approach and becomes a condition you live inside. And because nothing breaks loudly, nothing demands interruption. There's no crisis to point at, so the pattern hides in plain sight, disguised as realism, as caution, as being sensible. But what's actually happening is quieter and more unsettling. Your system learned that limiting thought feels safer than fully engaging. And once that lesson takes hold, the difficulty no longer needs a reason to stay. It stays because it always has. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. If thinking about money feels heavy before you even begin, if your mind slows down to protect itself, if clarity feels costly instead of helpful, then the real issue isn't discipline or motivation. It's the assumption you stopped questioning a long time ago. The assumption that this mental resistance is normal, that thinking about money is supposed to feel draining. Because once that assumption settles in, you stop looking for an off switch. And if your brain decided that thinking leads to strain instead of relief, then the most unsettling question isn't why you avoid it. It's when that decision was made, and how much of your financial life has been shaped by a system that learned quietly and early that not thinking felt safer than thinking at all.